And, there was, as you know, whoever you are, wherever you are within the sound of my voice, as you know, there was a lot of both a post-election analysis and, I would say, finger-pointing after Donald Trump became president in 2016 as a result of the 2016 election. And there's one aspect of that election that I think has been somewhat underreported, and our next guest has written an excellent piece about it for Current Affairs magazine. Malaika Jabali is a Brooklyn-based public policy attorney. She is also a writer whose work has appeared in a number of magazines, including Glamour, Essence, The Root, and of course, Current Affairs. Her piece there, the one that we're going to talk about today, was headlined "The Color of Economic Anxiety," and she joins us now. So first of all, Malaika, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And secondly, well, I don't want to summarize your piece. I do this every week. I start to summarize writers' pieces for them. Why don't you just briefly tell us what the piece was about?
It's covering what I feel is a completely erased story. I wanted to push back on the narrative that the working class is kind of mutually inclusively white. We think of the working class as, kind of Midwestern blue-collar voters. And often when we think of that, we don't keep in mind the scores of Black people, of Black working class voters in that region, the history of Black people who moved to the Midwest during the Great Migration. And the 2016 story is really a story of non-voters, and that's something that has gone completely underreported. So it's looking at specifically the Black people in Wisconsin who shifted the state red for the first time in about 30 years. And when people think of Wisconsin, they're normally thinking about maybe, cornfields and dairy farmers. And the assumption was that it was a decline in white voters who probably shifted, they defected from the Democratic Party and shifted from Obama to Trump, when really the story of Milwaukee and Wisconsin largely is a story of Black people who stayed home and somewhat of the Democratic base.
This has been on my mind for a long time, which is one of the reasons I'm glad you did such a great job writing about it, because, I've wondered why it is that so many people who, let's say, are centrist Democrats ideologically and perhaps by profession as well, have danced around, in my opinion, that's my conclusion, danced around the issue of the drop in Black voter participation, let's say between 2012 and 2016, and its effect on the election. They fixate on a relatively small number of Green Party voters, or they fixate on, as you say, the white voters who went from Democratic to Republican. But you have this whole issue of working class voters in these swing states that Hillary Clinton lost that don't get touched because they're Black. And you go into the, and of course, for all I know, racism is a factor there too. But you go into the numbers, the fact that there are 359,000 Black residents of Milwaukee, and voter participation among Black, or in Wisconsin, excuse me, and voter participation in Wisconsin was way down in 2016 among Black voters, wasn't it?
Yes, it fell the lowest in the state's history, at least in recorded history. I went as far back as about the 1960s, back to Nixon. Look at the census records, and it has never been as low as it was. It went from about 79% in 2012 to about 47%. That amounted to a loss of about 80,000 votes. Throughout the country, about 33 states, Black voter turnout fell. So instead of kind of asking the hard questions of what did we do to lose Black voters, I think it was easy to go with the narrative that this is simply an election about white bigotry. And what I wanted to ensure that I included in the piece is that that narrative will always be a story. As long as you have a Republican president, as long as you have white supremacy, you're going to have white people who will vote for their interests and vote for a Republican. 60% of white people vote for Republican every year since Nixon. So that does not change. That did not change with Donald Trump. The bigotry just got a little bit more explicit. But in terms of the sheer numbers, he got the same percentage of votes as Mitt Romney and George Bush and all of his other Republican predecessors. So to me, it's not even, it's not just a matter of fairness and justice and ensuring that all these, marginalized communities get their voices heard, but it's also a matter of accuracy and about being factual. And the difference in, just 3 states shifted the election. And I don't want to just say that it's about Black voters in Wisconsin. Very clearly, that's the narrative. But in Michigan and Pennsylvania as well, Hillary Clinton lost much of her Democratic base. So the idea here is to not just, claim this to be, a Black marginalization issue, but also kind of a discounting of your Democratic base across race. So it's a multiracial issue that the Democratic Party hasn't really captured in terms of the economic anxieties and the failure to mitigate conservative policy where states have experienced extreme deindustrialization in, states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. You made several great points there. One is, and one that I have made myself in my own writing, but I think you make it very strongly here and in the piece, and especially here. Republicans, I don't know a tactful way to say this. And again, we're talking to Malaika Jabali, who has written a piece on the color of economic anxiety for Current Affairs magazine. Republicans have been racist for a really long time. I've been following politics for a long time. I remember Richard Nixon's ploy. I remember Lee Atwater and the Willie Horton ads. I remember Welfare Queen under Ronald Reagan. It's hard to name a Republican president of the last 50 years who hasn't either, in some covert or indirect way, Ronald Reagan kicking off his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Missouri, a tiny town known only for the fact that 3 civil rights workers were murdered there. It seems to me, Trump's more crass about it, he's more direct about it, but as long as we pretend the problem is only Trump, we don't have to face the 2 things you address, and especially the second one you addressed so well in your piece, the fact that Republicans have been racist for a long time, but B, more to the point, this drop-off in voter participation across the board and among Black voters in these frontline states, because then I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm too cynical, but I feel like as long as we don't address that question that you address in your piece, then we don't have to address why that might be, which might lead to some uncomfortable conversations. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Precisely. I think without talking about the intersection of race and class, Democrats lose an opportunity to think more introspectively about their own failed economic policy, the ways that they have exacerbated some of these conservative policies by advocating for neoliberalism, by adopting a third way. And that adaptation happened in precisely the states where they need the Black vote, where they are a little bit more independent. If you look at the history, and there was only so much that I could include in this piece, but if you look at the history of Black workers there is a tradition and a culture of collective bargaining. There's a tradition of anti-establishment politics that extends from the 1910s and the turn of the 20th century. You wouldn't have had that many Black people moving from the South if they weren't kind of inherently anti-establishment by uprooting their lives completely and moving to, Chicago and Milwaukee and, Gary, Indiana, and the West Coast and Newark and, Philadelphia. They would not have moved to all of these cities in the first place if there was not already this desire to kind of change the trajectory that they had in the Jim Crow South. So you already have, this culture that's built in where they are anti-establishment, and, Marxism, Black socialism have had a strong foundation in the Midwest. People like Fred Hampton grew out of the Midwest and places in Chicago. You had the Black National Convention that was looking at a independent political party, and without confronting that, without recognizing that Black people are not a monolith, that we have different priorities that are going to diverge throughout the country, you're missing an opportunity to, one, win, and two, obviously achieve the justice that you say that your party is about.
Yeah, and I think there's a risk. It's really well said, and I think there's also a risk, one might say, even a tendency among certain white politicians and pundits, to liberal pundits or neoliberal pundits, as the case may be, and politicians to reduce Black voters to the single dimensionality of their race, and not their race in the context of class, not their race in the context of sociology, not their race in the context of political history. I mean, the same group of people will tend to conveniently forget that Dr. King, who, with no disrespect, I would say is probably every white person's favorite Black person, or most, was a socialist. That you mentioned Fred Hampton and some of the other activists on the Black left and so on. So, I guess there's this tendency to reduce to a single dimensionality an entire group of people who live life in the full dimensionality of human existence.
Precisely. Yeah, and that really showed, I think, in the 2016 election, and hopefully that is a rallying cry for Democrats to figure out what they want their ideology to be, what they want their identity to be. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's happening. But I'm hoping that this piece could be a wake-up call for some people who work in these political spaces and these spheres to be able to create policies that are actually going to attract people. And I was hoping that it would be time. So I did this reporting last year at the 50th anniversary of a lot of the uprisings that happened in the Midwest. So you had a civil unrest in Milwaukee in 1967. You also had it in Newark and Detroit. Detroit was pretty well known. There was actually a movie that came out that debuted last year going over that history, that historical account. And the same experiences and the same conditions that led to those uprisings, you could say also repeated the same consequences happened in 2016. So just about 3 months before Hillary Clinton was slated to be the presidential winner, and she was expecting people to vote for her in the general election, there was an uprising in August in Sherman Park, which is a pretty historically Black community. Had been mixed for a while, and it's a lot of Black middle class in this neighborhood. And there was an uprising there. And yet and still, Hillary Clinton, as the nominee, never showed up in Wisconsin once. And so you're expecting people to deal with, extreme unemployment. To put it into context, Wisconsin has the highest rate of Black male incarceration in the country. It has the highest rate of joblessness for Black men in their prime working years in the country. So you're dealing with all these socioeconomic factors, an uprising where people are literally yelling and expressing the despair that they're going through. And you don't even step foot in the state as a nominee. So how do you expect for people to vote for you? That should have been a wake-up call. And unfortunately, I don't know if they have been woken up by that.
Well, I think there's a fight going on, and I think there's an internal struggle going on in the Democratic Party. You mentioned a couple other things, too. You mentioned that while voter suppression is a factor, it's not the primary factor, and I think that's an important thing for people to understand. But I would add to that if you're expecting, and I'll just pick a type of person at random, a single mom working, changing shifts at a restaurant or something, to take 8 hours or 6 hours because of voter suppression, take 2 buses across town, wait online, vote, take 2 buses back, you better give her or any number of thousands of other people a compelling reason to vote. And I don't think they did that. Malaika, we have about a couple minutes left. And the one thing I want to touch on before we go there are the problems that are really, the Black community faces uniquely, the problems of social and institutional racism, the problems of structural violence, and so on. But then one of the other pet peeves that I have is that we hear so much in the pundit class about the white working class. We don't hear about the working class. We don't hear about those problems that are held by all working people across ethnicity, across demographic boundaries, and so on. I was wondering if you have any comments on that before we go.
That was the inspiration for the piece. I don't know. I mean, I think there are any number of reasons why that is. I think, being in a predominantly white society that was built on white supremacy, I think we tend to, the media, as, elected officials, there's a tendency to treat white interests as supreme, kind of regardless of the circumstances, even if, those are the same experiences across race. I think just being in a white country, those interests are going to be considered the most. And that is problematic, obviously, as I mentioned before, just out of a sense of fairness, but also because it may not be completely accurate, as we've seen with the current trends in terms of how the extent of Black people losing faith in the political system and losing faith in electoral politics. You're always going to have a contingency of white voters. And just to be clear, I think it's important to be cognizant of the failures of capitalism. That's what deindustrialization is about. That is what the kind of decimation of economic opportunity has been for Black people and people across race. It's about the failure of capitalism. So capitalism affects all of us. It just so happens to also affect Black people in unique ways and sometimes in more disparate ways because of the intersection with white supremacy, the intersection with racism. So you are going to see kind of this jobs policy, as sociologist Bruce Western calls it. A jobs policy in Wisconsin has been replaced with a prison policy. And it's easier to, comfort some of the white working class by knowing that there is this criminal element amongst young Black men where it's easy to pit these two demographics against each other. So I think we have to fight, that tendency again, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because if you want to win, you're not going to get it by just appealing to one demographic.
Well, I think that's really well said, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. So Malaika Jabali, public interest attorney and public policy attorney, but public interest too, writer and activist. Thanks for writing such a great piece, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.